In 1833, the nation of France imported 41.5 million medicinal leeches. A single pharmacy shelf groaned under the weight of glass jars packed with writhing, bloodthirsty annelids. Wealthy patients paid a premium to have the creatures applied to their skin by the dozen. Poor women waded barefoot into stagnant marshes, offering their own legs as bait to catch the harvest. The medical world believed that human blood was the singular source of all human suffering, and they were willing to drain the entire continent dry to prove it. The scale of this industry was unparalleled in the history of clinical medicine. Apothecaries across Europe operated as clearinghouses for the Hirudo medicinalis. They sourced their stock from the damp, mosquito-ridden wetlands of the French countryside. The demand was so aggressive that the local population of leeches faced near total extinction. Professional leech mongers lived in a state of permanent, low-grade anemia. They walked through swamp water for hours, waiting for the creatures to latch onto their shins. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and physically debilitating. But to understand why 41.5 million leeches seemed like a rational medical strategy, you have to see the distorted logic that gripped the 19th century mind. French physician François-Joseph Victor Broussais sat at the center of this obsession. He argued that the vast majority of human diseases were caused by localized inflammation. In his view, the only way to arrest this process was to extract the excess blood immediately. Broussais did not suggest a modest extraction. He prescribed the application of dozens of leeches to a single patient in one sitting. His influence was so pervasive that medical students flocked to his lectures in Paris. They carried his teachings back to every corner of Europe and the Americas. The practice turned the human body into a battlefield of humors. If a patient suffered from gout, the doctor applied leeches to the affected joint. If a patient complained of a headache, the leeches were placed behind the ears. The sight of a patient covered in bleeding, swollen parasites became a common feature of hospital wards. It was not merely a folk remedy practiced by village healers. It was the standard of care endorsed by the most prestigious medical faculties. The reality was that these patients were often suffering from infections or systemic illnesses. The bloodletting simply weakened their immune systems further. The leechmongers became the hidden backbone of this brutal economy. These gatherers often lived in abject poverty, selling their harvest to middlemen for pennies. The leeches were then packed into wet clay or linen bags for transport. They were shipped by the cartload to major urban centers like Paris, London, and Berlin. The industry operated with the logistical precision of a modern supply chain, yet the product remained an animal that had not changed in millions of years. It was a prehistoric solution applied to the ailments of the industrial age. The wetlands of France could not sustain the harvest for long. By the middle of the century, the supply began to vanish, forcing dealers to look toward the marshes of Russia and Hungary. The medical craze had successfully stripped the European landscape of its natural inhabitants. But the true nature of the leech remained a mystery to the physicians who used them. They saw only the blood flowing out, and they mistook the result for a cure. The practice did not begin in the fevered clinics of 19th century Paris. It stretched back 3.5 millennia into the silt of the Nile. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to roughly 1550 BCE, serves as the earliest written record of the practice. It lists the application of leeches among the essential remedies for internal ailments. But to see the reality of this ancient medicine, one must look to the tomb of Pharaoh Amenemhat. The wall paintings, dating to approximately 1500 BCE, depict the ritual of the bloodletting. The images show the leeches applied to the skin with careful clinical intent. Egyptian healers viewed the body as a network of vessels, requiring constant maintenance. They believed that stagnation led to disease within these channels. The leech acted as a physical key to unlock the flow. It was a standardized procedure for balancing the fundamental fluids of life. The tomb art confirms that this was not a desperate, last-ditch effort. It was a central pillar of the Egyptian medical system for centuries. The practice relied on the same biological reality that would later baffle European physicians. The healers of the Nile recognized the leech as a tool of precision. They placed the creatures where the pain was most acute. They sought to restore health by removing the excess that blocked the path. This ancient, silent witness on the tomb walls established a precedent. It set a standard for medical intervention that would persist for thousands of years. The knowledge was recorded on papyrus and painted in stone to ensure its survival. But it was only the beginning of a much longer, darker history. The belief that blood held the secret to human health proved remarkably durable. It survived the rise and fall of the pharaohs. It traveled across the Mediterranean to the shores of Greece and the heart of Rome. But to understand why this Egyptian observation became a global dogma, you must look to the Roman Empire. The logic of the balance was about to be codified into a system that no doctor would dare challenge. A marble bust of Galen of Pergamon stares from the Roman archives of the 2nd century CE. Galen of Pergamon lived from 129 to 216 CE. He served as the physician to emperors and gladiators alike. His medical writings became the absolute law for Western physicians. Galen of Pergamon codified the theory of the four humors. He declared that human health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was simply an excess of one fluid over the others. He identified blood as the most vital of these four substances. An excess of blood was known as plethora. Galen of Pergamon asserted that plethora caused almost every known ailment. The solution was a direct and brutal physical intervention. He argued that doctors must drain the excess liquid from the veins. This doctrine turned the human body into a vessel of measurable fluids. Medical students across the Roman Empire memorized his texts for centuries. The logic remained unchallenged through the fall of Rome and the Middle Ages. Physicians looked at a fevered patient and saw only an imbalance of blood. They reached for the nearest tool to restore the internal harmony. The leech became the primary instrument for this systematic extraction. But to understand why this idea persisted for 1,500 years, you need to see the weight of the tradition. Galen of Pergamon was the preeminent authority of the ancient world. No doctor dared to question the writings of the man who served emperors. The four humors theory provided a simple answer to complex biological suffering. Patients were bled for everything from gout to simple headaches. The practice was not a suggestion, it was a rigid medical mandate. Monks and university scholars copied his texts into new manuscripts. The knowledge survived the collapse of empires in the vellum of library scrolls. It locked European medicine into a cycle of bloodletting that lasted well into the 19th century. Every doctor was trained to find the excess and drain it away. The human body was never allowed to heal on its own terms. It was always subjected to the iron rule of the humors. The legacy of Galen of Pergamon was a millennium of patients drained by their own physicians. The truth was that the system was fundamentally flawed. But the authority of the ancient master was too heavy to break. By 1824, the medical world entered its most aggressive phase of bloodletting. The French physician, François-Joseph Victor Broussais, led this transformation. He argued that nearly all human disease originated in inflammation. He claimed that the stomach was the primary site of this irritation. To treat this, he prescribed a massive systemic draining of blood. His clinic in Paris became a theater of extreme medical intervention. Patients arrived seeking relief from fevers, gout, and common headaches. They left with dozens of leeches attached to their torsos and limbs. François-Joseph Victor Broussais routinely applied 30 to 50 leeches at once. He targeted the abdomen as the focal point for the blood removal. The sight of the engorged, writhing creatures became a common hospital scene. This was not a subtle or isolated clinical technique. It was an industrial-scale medical mandate that swept across the continent. The demand for Hirudo medicinalis shattered the existing supply chains. Apothecaries could no longer rely on local ponds to fill their orders. They turned to the marshlands of Russia, Hungary, and Germany. The trade in leeches became a massive, lucrative international enterprise. In 1833 alone, France imported roughly 41.5 million medicinal leeches. This volume of consumption decimated the populations of European wetlands. The species nearly vanished from the ecosystems that once sustained them. But to understand why this frenzy persisted, you must see the human cost. The patients were often already weakened by their underlying illnesses. The doctors viewed the resulting pallor as a sign of successful healing. The truth was that the treatment frequently induced severe anemia. The practice did not cure the inflammation it claimed to resolve. It merely drained the life force of those who sought a remedy. The clinics of Paris became known for their rows of pale, exhausted patients. The medical establishment of the era cheered the work of François-Joseph Victor Broussais. He was hailed as a revolutionary for his aggressive, systematic approach. His theories dominated the curriculum at the most prestigious medical schools. Yet, the ecological impact was as severe as the medical one. Entire regions were stripped of their natural aquatic life to meet quotas. The marshes of Eastern Europe were drained and harvested with ruthless efficiency. The era of inflammation was a period of profound biological loss. But to see the true absurdity of this trend, you need only follow the money. The cost of a single leech rose as the natural habitats collapsed. Apothecaries tracked the market price like commodities on a modern exchange. The medical obsession had successfully turned a simple worm into a luxury resource. The reality was that the practice had outpaced the capacity of nature. Every patient bled represented a small piece of a disappearing ecosystem. The medical community remained blind to the obvious decline in patient health. They doubled down on the bloodletting as the only logical path forward. The legacy of this peak was a landscape empty of its natural inhabitants. It was a period of history defined by the relentless extraction of blood. The medical world finally turned its attention to the chemistry inside the worm. In 1884, the British scientist John Haycraft examined the bite of the creature. He observed that the site of the incision refused to clot. John Haycraft isolated a powerful substance from the leech's salivary glands. He named the anticoagulant hirudin. This discovery marked the first scientific explanation for the ancient practice. The substance prevented the blood from thickening during the feeding process. But the full complexity of the saliva remained hidden for decades. Modern researchers later identified a suite of bioactive proteins. They found calin, which actively prevents platelet aggregation at the wound site. They isolated destabilase, an enzyme that dissolves fibrin clots in the blood. They discovered hyaluronidase, a compound that increases tissue permeability. This mixture of chemicals allowed the leech to feed without interruption. The truth was that the leech was a sophisticated pharmacological machine. It was not merely draining blood as the ancients believed. It was injecting a cocktail of complex proteins into the host. These substances reduced local swelling and maintained blood flow. The medical community began to see the leech as a tool of precision. But to understand why this mattered, you must look at the physical reality. The leech did not care about the four humors of Galen. It operated on the cold, biological mandate of survival. Its saliva was the result of millions of years of evolution. Every protein served a specific, measurable function in the digestive process. The discovery of hirudin changed the trajectory of medical research. Scientists no longer viewed the bite as a mystical event. They saw it as a biochemical interaction between two organisms. The era of blind bloodletting finally faced the light of modern science. But the legacy of the 19th century obsession remained in the archives. The millions of leeches harvested for Broussais were wasted on a false theory. They were used to treat conditions that had no relation to inflammation. The science of the bite was ignored for the sake of dogma. It took until the 20th century to bridge that gap. Researchers proved that the leech was a master of anticoagulation. The ancient practice contained a kernel of genuine clinical utility. But that utility was buried under layers of superstition and misuse. The shift from folklore to chemistry was slow and methodical. It turned the leech from a symbol of death into a surgical asset. But the transition was fraught with the weight of its own history. The biology was real, but the historical application was a catastrophe. The truth was that the chemistry was always there, waiting to be understood. It simply took a century for medicine to catch up to the worm. The mid-19th century arrived with a mounting pile of bodies. Physicians continued to apply leeches to patients suffering from scarlet fever and pneumonia. The medical establishment held fast to the ancient dogma of the four humors. But the reality of the hospital wards told a different story. Patients grew weaker with every application of the worm. The death toll in European clinics began to climb to impossible heights. A shift in the scientific landscape finally began to take root in the laboratory. The French chemist Louis Pasteur studied the process of fermentation in the 1850s. He demonstrated that microorganisms were responsible for the transformation of organic matter. His work laid the essential foundation for the germ theory of disease. The medical community slowly realized that infections came from external, microscopic invaders. Bloodletting did nothing to address the presence of these invisible pathogens. The German physician Robert Koch further solidified this new understanding of medicine. He identified the specific bacteria responsible for tuberculosis and cholera. His research transformed the way doctors viewed the internal state of the human body. The focus moved away from the balance of fluids to the destruction of germs. Archaic practices like leeching suddenly appeared not just ineffective, but actively dangerous. Doctors started to recognize that bloodletting weakened the patient's ability to fight infection. The practice of applying leeches to a feverish patient only invited new complications. The leeches themselves served as vectors for dangerous bacterial transmission. Medical journals began to publish reports detailing the hazards of the practice. The influence of François-Joseph Victor Broussais finally began to wane in the medical schools. His aggressive theories of inflammation were replaced by rigorous microbiological study. The era of the piss prophets and the blood-obsessed physician reached a sharp conclusion. The widespread use of medicinal leeches plummeted across the continent. Hospitals discarded their glass jars and emptied their aquatic supply tanks. The once lucrative trade in leeches collapsed as the scientific consensus shifted. Medicine moved toward a future defined by sanitation and the study of bacteria. The transition was a violent rejection of nearly 2 millennia of established dogma. The truth was that the patient had been the victim of the theory all along. The death of the humoral system marked the beginning of modern clinical practice. But the history of the practice left a permanent scar on the medical record. Millions of lives had been lost to the simple, misguided belief in bloodletting. The transition to germ theory ended the age of the leech as a universal cure. Science had finally peeled back the veil of superstition. The medical world would never return to the practice of indiscriminate drainage. The age of the worm had finally come to its quiet, necessary end. A historical record sits in the archives of medical pathology. It details a persistent, invisible danger lurking inside the medicinal leech. The creature, known as Hirudo medicinalis, carried a passenger within its gut. That passenger was a rod-shaped bacterium called Aeromonas hydrophila. For centuries, this symbiotic organism lived quietly inside the digestive tract of the worm. In the 19th century, physicians remained unaware of this microscopic inhabitant. They applied leeches to open skin without any form of sterilization. The worm punctured the dermis to feed on the host's blood. As it fed, it naturally regurgitated fluids from its gut into the wound site. This biological process introduced Aeromonas hydrophila directly into the patient. The unintended result was often a severe, localized infection at the site of the bite. Physicians at the time frequently misidentified these infections as part of the disease process. They assumed the fever or swelling was a sign that the body was purging toxins. In truth, the patient was suffering from a new, leech-borne bacterial invasion. The historical medical record shows thousands of cases where the cure worsened the condition. Patients already weakened by pneumonia or scarlet fever were suddenly fighting a secondary pathogen. The practice of leeching turned the hospital ward into a site of cross-contamination. Doctors moved from patient to patient, often reusing the same leeches. This practice allowed the bacteria to travel from one host to another with ease. The medical journals of the era began to document the unexpected complications of the therapy. Wounds turned septic and necrotic, defying the standard treatments of the day. The reality was that the leech acted as a vector for dangerous microbes. It took the development of modern bacteriology to identify the hidden threat. Researchers eventually isolated Aeromonas hydrophila from the gut of the medicinal worm. They confirmed that the bacterium was perfectly adapted to the leech's internal environment. This discovery explained why so many historical patients experienced strange, lingering infections. The symbiosis between the worm and the bacteria was a biological fact, not a medical theory. But to understand why this matters today, you have to look at the modern clinical protocol. Doctors today do not apply leeches without rigorous preparation. Every patient undergoing modern hirudotherapy receives a course of prophylactic antibiotics. These medications target Aeromonas hydrophila before it can establish a foothold in the tissue. The medical community now manages the leech as a controlled, high-risk biological device. They acknowledge that the worm is both a miracle of anticoagulation and a source of infection. The historical ignorance of this symbiosis cost countless lives in the centuries before germ theory. The worm remained the same, but the understanding of the bite changed forever. Science stripped away the mystery and replaced it with a calculated, sterile reality. The risk of infection no longer defined the practice, because it was now effectively managed. The leech was no longer a symbol of superstition, but a tool of precision surgery. It was a dangerous, living instrument that finally submitted to the rigors of modern medicine. The medical community spent decades distancing itself from the leech. The creature remained a relic of a darker, unscientific past. But the biology of the worm refused to be ignored by surgeons. In the late 20th century, microsurgeons faced a recurring, brutal problem. Reattached limbs often suffered from trapped, stagnant blood. Small veins could not be reconnected quickly enough to save the tissue. The delicate skin of a reattached finger began to turn black and necrotic. Surgeons watched helpless as their intricate work failed due to venous congestion. They needed a way to drain the blood without causing further trauma. They turned back to the ancient, discarded tool of the apothecary. The medicinal leech returned to the operating theater in the late 1980s. It was no longer a cure-all for the humors of the body. It became a precise biological pump for the modern surgical suite. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration monitored these clinical trials closely. They evaluated the safety of using a living organism as a surgical device. The evidence from the operating room proved the efficacy of the treatment. On June 28, 2004, the FDA granted official clearance for its use. The agency classified Hirudo medicinalis as a legitimate medical device. The decision was not a return to the era of the piss prophets. It was a narrow, strictly controlled authorization for specialized reconstructive surgery. The FDA mandate required that every leech be sourced from a sterile lab. No longer could a collector pull a worm from a stagnant pond. Each creature arrived in a sealed container, certified free of disease. The protocol for application became as rigorous as any other surgical procedure. The leech was applied only to relieve congestion in failing tissue grafts. It functioned as a living, temporary drain for blood that could not exit. This was the final evolution of a practice spanning 3 millennia. The leech had transitioned from a God-touched relic to a sterile medical tool. Science had finally harnessed the biology that had once baffled the ancients. The worm remained, but the context of its bite changed completely. It no longer represented the whims of demons or the balance of bile. It functioned as a calculated, precise mechanism in the hands of a surgeon. The irony of history was complete on that day in 2004. The most maligned creature in medical history was finally redeemed. It was a victory of observation over the weight of archaic dogma. The medical record now recognized the worm for what it truly was. It was a biological instrument, refined by biology and validated by law. A surgeon looks down at the sterile white landscape of an operating theater. Beneath the bright lights, a patient lies motionless on the table. A reattached finger sits at the center of the surgical field. The skin of the digit is dark, bruised, and swollen with trapped blood. Small veins within the tissue failed to reconnect during the initial surgery. The blood flows into the finger, but cannot find a path back out. This venous congestion creates a deadly, stagnant pool of fluid. Without intervention, the tissue will die and turn to necrotic waste. The surgeon reaches for a small, sealed container on the metal tray. Inside the glass vial rests a single Hirudo medicinalis. This creature is not a relic of a medieval apothecary. It is a sterile, laboratory-bred tool of modern reconstructive medicine. The surgeon carefully places the leech onto the congested tip of the finger. The worm attaches its suction cup to the swollen purple skin. It begins to feed, acting as a living biological pump. The leech draws the excess blood away from the failing graft site. As the worm feeds, it releases a potent cocktail of chemical compounds. Hirudin enters the wound to keep the blood from clotting too quickly. Kaolin prevents the platelets from clumping at the site of the bite. Destabilase works to dissolve the microscopic fibrin clots in the tissue. Hyaluronidase breaks down the connective barriers to increase local blood flow. The finger begins to lose its dark, stagnant hue. Fresh, oxygenated blood begins to circulate back into the graft. The leech remains attached for nearly an hour, slowly inflating. It drains the congestion that the surgeon's own needles could not reach. This process prevents the total necrosis of the reattached tissue. The medical team monitors the patient's vital signs with electronic sensors. They track the progress of the tissue color as the leech performs its task. When the worm detaches, the wound continues to ooze slightly. This bleeding is a sign that the local circulation has finally resumed. The surgeon discards the used leech into a biohazard container. Every creature is used only once to prevent any risk of cross-contamination. The patient receives a dose of prophylactic antibiotics to ward off infection. These drugs target the Aeromonas hydrophila naturally present in the leech gut. This modern protocol ensures the ancient worm serves only the surgeon's goal. The procedure saves the finger from the surgeon's scalpel and amputation. It is a precise, calculated intervention in the world of micro-reconstruction. The ancient practice of bloodletting has vanished from the modern hospital. In its place stands a specialized, evidence-based surgical technique. The biology of the worm finally met the needs of the human hand. The result is a successful, living graft that defies the odds of trauma. The history of the leech spans 4,000 years of human desperation. It began with the Ebers Papyrus in 1550 BCE Egypt. It evolved into the rigid doctrine of the four humors under Galen of Pergamon. For 15 centuries, physicians bled their patients to balance invisible fluids. In 1833, France imported 41.5 million leeches to feed an industrial medical mania. François-Joseph Victor Broussais turned the practice into a weapon of mass depletion. He treated every fever and inflammation as a battle to be won with blood. The wetlands of Europe were drained to satisfy this insatiable appetite for the worm. Then, the scientific landscape shifted beneath the feet of the medical establishment. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved that germs, not humors, caused disease. Bloodletting was exposed as a dangerous, archaic error that drained the dying. The practice withered as the world embraced the rigor of the laboratory. Yet the biology of the leech remained an untapped chemical factory. John Haycraft isolated hiruridin in 1884, unlocking the secret of the bite. Modern research eventually mapped the complex enzymes of the leech gut. Kaolin, destabilase, and hyaluronidase replaced the ancient myth of demonic influence. On June 28, 2004, the FDA finally validated the creature as a medical device. The worm returned to the hospital, no longer a cure-all, but a specialized tool. It now sits in a sterile vial, serving the precise needs of the microsurgeon. The cycle of history closed, moving from the pond to the operating theater. You look at the sterile glass of the modern medical world and think the danger is contained. You believe the leeches are safely locked behind regulatory glass. But the hunger of the worm never truly vanished. It only waited for the right host. You are now the vessel for this ancient, persistent design.